So I don't know if Julius Malema is this 4D chess player. Maybe he wants just to play kingmaker and just pick and choose which party becomes or which mayor is going to be elected when it suits him. So maybe he doesn't want to be loyal. Maybe he wants to show that, listen, I can make you king or I can destroy you. And therefore you must be very wary of me.
Because Malema is also known to flip-flop on many issues. And I wonder whether Mashaba, he would say it's about establishing relationships and forming coalitions and that kind of thing. But you should also surely have a line. I mean, you have your core principles on which you won't compromise.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore the perspectives of those we agree with, and then we ignore the rest. Today, we're going to have a little chat about the future of South African politics, and if there is a future for libertarianism in it. Joining us to discuss is Chris Hattingh, the Deputy Director at the Freemarket Foundation, and Dumo Denga, who is the host of the Man Patria podcast. So Chris, let's start with you. A lot of people say that they like to say before this local election that the ANC will rule until Jesus comes, or perhaps that was just, Jacob Zuma. But now a lot of people say it's almost like a foregone conclusion that the ANC will drop below 50%. But I mean, I know you are a lot more knowledgeable than most journalists who like to just report about tweets. Do you think it's already over for the ANC, or do you think they can claw back that support?
Well, hi, Donald. Thanks for having me on. And Dumo, always a pleasure to get to talk to you. I'm really looking forward to this. Yeah, with the ANC, I think if there's anything that they've taught or should have taught South Africans for the last 27 years is maybe expect the unexpected. So when one looks at broader trends, yes, it seems to be declining, especially in terms of municipal and national elections and the number of votes. But that doesn't mean that the ANC, the sort of idea of the ANC isn't still very strong and prevalent. We're almost now 3 decades after the fall of apartheid. So the ANC, I think, is still very much using the role that it played in that fight, that is still very much entrenched in a lot of South Africans' minds. That being said, if you look at the proportion of the population that is much younger now and how big that proportion is, the ANC might not have the same hold on them that they might have on older South Africans who were very much faced with the hardships and abuses of apartheid on a day-to-day basis. There, I think the EFF, for example, could be doing a lot better. It's a bit surprising, actually, that with a 74% youth unemployment rate, the EFF isn't actually doing better. That might be a bit of an indictment on them, and their funders of all stripes should maybe be asking some questions about why they only get 13% every now and then. So when you look at global long-term trends, yes, I think the ANC is declining. I think there's going to be lots of thrashing still going on in different ways, the different factions fighting between themselves for the spoils. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen, even in the last week, Minister Sisulu with her article on IOL, how that is causing some ructions with her attack on the constitution. So different people playing to different bases. So I would advise those interested in this kind of real world politicking, as it were, to look at the ANC Congress coming up this year. That's sort of when you see the beast, as it were, awaken again, and the different players play off each other and try and rule the roost. So I think that'll be a good indication already this year of where the ANC will go the rest of this decade.
Yeah, Duma, a lot of people, I think this is not a new line for Ramaphoria, is that just wait for the elective conference. Then they will get the better decisions approved, and then it will change. So do you think then things will change, or is the ANC, they are just on their way out?
Yeah, it's I think when you say change, it depends what you mean by it. Are you saying change a leader? Yeah, they probably will change a leader, but will they really change their trajectory or what they want to do? Because, the ANC is big on the NDR, and even Ramaphosa has mentioned its commitment towards the NDR. And I don't think that they're going to change that. However, I do think that we may see, the factional battles becoming a bit more aggressive. You remember in the last, I think, conference that the ANC had in Nasrec, if I'm not mistaken, Ramaphosa, he won by a margin. It wasn't really a landslide. So it shows that the ANC is split. So I think if and then mentioning on their way out, I think also that is also a good point. Usually, I mean, I don't know where I heard this from, but they say usually like revolutionary movements or liberation movements, they last about like 30 years, plus minus 30 years, and then they're out afterwards. So I think ANC is on that trajectory now, because remember, there's a lot of young people that are eligible to vote, and they probably did not vote, or they didn't even register. So a lot of people are just probably not interested anymore. And then the older generations, they'll be loyal to the ANC, but eventually what's going to happen, they're going to pass on, and then they're going to then the proportion of votes that are going to the ANC will be less and less and less over time. So I think it's a good opportunity for just to get young people to vote. I don't know if the ANC are on their way out. I mean, things change. I mean, I remember, if you look at Zim, for example, I mean, you saw when Morgan Tsvangirai, when he first challenged Mugabe, and then it looked like his party won, and then there was this runoff, and then, there was just so much chaos. And then in the election after that, ZANU-PF just, it was a landslide. Now, people are going to question it and say, hey, was it really a landslide? Was there vote rigging? But I mean, you know what I mean? I think that is possible, but it looks like ANC is on the way out.
Chris, I mean, you mentioned that it's strange that the EFF is not picking up those votes. Why is that? Why isn't the EFF picking up those votes? Is it perhaps Julius Malema? Why isn't that?
I wonder if it boils down to a case of rhetoric not meeting the rubber, not meeting the road, as it were. So they haven't yet governed anywhere where they could show whether they're capable of providing services, for example. So it could be a case of lofty rhetoric. We can promise lots of things, but in the same way, you get that from the ANC. So many voters could say, Julius is simply repeating a lot of points that we've heard from ANC leaders. So will he actually deliver? Well, why not just stick with the devil we know kind of thing? I think that might be one explanation. Another might simply be, I think the last few years with the lockdowns, the EFF, they're probably the party that has felt that the most. They're very sort of spectacle driven, the optics, that kind of thing, being on the ground, being with large crowds, that kind of thing. And when you can't do that due to lockdowns, so maybe in a way we should thank the government for imposing harsh lockdowns, because the EFF hasn't had their big events. But I think that's also partly it. They need scandal. They need all that kind of stuff. So maybe now again, with the ANC elective conference coming up, they might try to play kingmaker in some ways. I would argue that that's a longer game that Malema is playing in the metros. Now, for example, giving his quote unquote support to the DA, for example, and ActionSA to get the ANC out. I think he's playing a longer game towards the national election in 2024, where he's going to try and sort of operate in the background and try and get what he wants out of the ANC. We might get a more radical version of expropriation without compensation, more so radical than the ANC themselves might even want, but trying to appease the EFF and getting their votes. Another reason why the EFF might not be doing that well is that some people might simply be seeing through the rhetoric. So I know that sometimes some of us sort of in the analysis and commentariat, we think that South Africans are sort of quote unquote ripe for the pickings. They're just waiting for the first person to come and promise them something, and they'll all follow them. They're like, it's like a hive mind. They're going to believe whatever he says. But maybe a lot of them see through what he says. They see a bit of a charlatan, a bit of a snake oil salesman, and they're not going to follow sort of his lofty dreams. And they realize, I mean, someone who drives around in a Land Rover with his Gucci shoes and all that stuff, maybe he isn't really a man of the people. It's just for show kind of thing. So I think it's a multifaceted answer. There's probably other stuff that I'm not even thinking of right now, but the EFF, they're still going to play a big role, I think, going forward. But they also seem to be, I don't think they're wielding their full potential. And for different reasons, I also think a party like the ACDP in a relatively more conservative country aren't playing to their strengths and not doing as well as I thought a party like that would do.
Yeah, to our viewers, I'm just occasionally rubbing my face with this cloth because if you close the windows and the fan, you're basically cooking yourself in this heat. But Dumo, a lot of people say, okay, but yes, Julius Malema, he's a strategic genius because he gave the DA power in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni. But I mean, but wasn't he basically forced to do that? Because I mean, at the end of the day, he has to choose someone. But I mean, he can't be constantly the opposition party that just, okay, I'm not going to pick the ANC or the DA. I mean, he has to choose someone. Why would you vote for him then?
Right. Look, yeah, maybe Julius Malema is this, 4D chess player. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe there's something. It depends on what the objective that he's trying to achieve. I think, looking at that, I think perhaps he was forced to choose, but also, I think the EFF has got a reputation for backstabbing. So you saw what they did in Nelson Mandela Bay. You saw what happened even in Joburg as well, and you also saw what happened in, I think, was it Tshwane? I'm not sure, but what these guys were doing, they played kingmaker, and then when they didn't get their way, they got stabbed in the back. So I think what's happening now is that, all these parties that want to rely on the EFF to, get some sort of, I wouldn't say dominance, but get some sort of influence or something. I think what's going to happen is that they're going to be very wary of the EFF. They'll rather say, you know what, let's rather go to everyone else besides the EFF. Then the EFF, no one's going to approach them, but yet they can still decide who's the kingmaker at the end of the day. So, so that way, if the EFF, let's say, ends up voting for the DA, which they did, let's say in, was it Joburg, right? And Ekurhuleni. I think ultimately, if the EFF want to do any backstabbing, it may not hurt the DA that badly. So I think the EFF actually, in my opinion, they actually shot themselves in the foot when they backstabbed the DA, because now other parties are just not going to be reliant. I mean, if you look at ActionSA, they said they spoke to EFF, and I don't think the negotiations went well, in my opinion. So, and I think that's the reason. I think someone told them, you just can't trust these guys. So I don't know if Julius Malema is this 4D chess player. Maybe he wants just to play kingmaker and just pick and choose which party becomes, or which mayor is going to be elected when it suits him. So maybe he doesn't want to be loyal. Maybe he wants to show that, listen, I can make you king or I can destroy you. And therefore you must be very wary of me. So maybe that's why people say he's a brilliant strategist, but it depends how you look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned ActionSA, Chris. One guy I don't really understand is Herman Mashaba and his relationship with Julius Malema and the EFF. Because, I mean, here's a guy who preaches like conservatism and probably stands for everything politically that the EFF is not, but he always wants to include them in negotiations, and he's very favorable towards them and then very antagonistic towards the DA. What is your opinion of this guy and this party?
Yeah, it's interesting when he was mayor, of course, when he was still part of the DA, there was a lot of wins that he tried to give the EFF to try and appease them, the whole thing with outsourcing, insourcing workers, that whole story. I mean, I wonder if he isn't, at the end of the day, purely a pragmatist who will side with anyone who gives him power in the long run. I mean, when one looks at his career as a businessman and some of the stuff he's said and written in the past, it would very much be considered the sort of classical liberal kind of thing: free markets, limited government, lower taxes, free speech. But then when it comes to governance, I wonder if his justification would be, when you get into politics, you're going to have to compromise. You're going to have to maybe not be as strong in your principles, as it were. So I wish I could say for sure that I know him very well and I've sort of got a line directly to him and understand his motivations. But from the outside, it looks, I mean, it almost looks in a way like a bit of a Malema imitation in a way, because Malema is also known to flip-flop on many issues. And I wonder whether Mashaba, he would say it's about establishing relationships and forming coalitions and that kind of thing, but you should also surely have a line. I mean, you have your core principles on which you won't compromise. There might be other stuff, and I'm not saying politics is easy and governance is easy, there might be stuff that you will say, okay, this isn't a big core principle of mine, let's compromise on this. But on stuff like property rights and limited government and lower spending, for a liberal, you probably shouldn't compromise on those things. So I just wonder what sort of longer game he's playing. As I mentioned earlier, with the ACDP not performing as well as I thought they maybe should be doing, given South Africa is quite conservative and traditional in large parts. I wonder if Mashaba is going to look at entering that sort of space. When you look around the world, I mean, obviously Donald Trump did very well in the US with his winning the presidency. You have Viktor Orban in Hungary, you have Boris Johnson in the UK. So I wonder if you get a sort of similar figure in South Africa who's a bit center-right, plays into the sort of proudly South African, our people first kind of thing, if that will resonate with voters. It's a bit of a sort of right populism, I suppose. So I wonder if he's aiming towards that. It's interesting, of course, that you say, one would think that a lot of his principles go against everything that the EFF, for example, would advocate for and stand for. But even then, as I mentioned with Malema, it's not as though he and Floyd Shivambu and other highlights in the party are these working class heroes who forego the trappings of modern life and live in sort of poverty with the people, as it were, quote unquote. They live the high life and they enjoy all sorts of material benefits. So you wonder, are they actually that committed to their principles, or for them is it also just a case of pragmatism and sort of compromise? So yeah, Mashaba I think is a fascinating figure, and ActionSA I think will continue to play a pretty big role, especially in the metros in the next few years.
Yeah, Dumo, what's your opinion of ActionSA and Herman Mashaba?
Yeah, Herman Mashaba. Yeah, man, I think ActionSA, as a party, they seem to be this decent alternative. However, I mean, a decent alternative to the ANC. However, they look like they've got COPE tendencies. I got a feeling that they might end up like COPE because, now already you saw, because I was on another show this morning and they mentioned that, what was her name? Was it Khoza? I think she resigned. Well, she stepped down rather because of other duties. And then now ActionSA released a statement saying that we asked her to step down. And that kind of gives off, that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good because I think ultimately that's just going to really drive wedges. And apparently there are faction battles going on there. And we saw what happened with COPE, man. COPE was a disaster. I mean, I remember at one of their conferences, I mean, the faction battles got so heavy that people were throwing chairs at each other, So it escalated. And then as a result, people just lost interest in the party and they just became smaller and smaller. And I mean, they had potential. So I just hope ActionSA doesn't end up like that. I do think that they do speak to the concerns of many South Africans, like, the border issues and the issue of foreigners and stuff like that. I know the EFF tried to take a different approach, saying open borders, and that didn't kind of work with many South Africans. They're like, no way. So I think ActionSA are probably going to push that even further, but they need to keep together. They need, Mashaba's just going to have to say, listen, guys, we have factions, but let's just, keep it behind closed doors. Let's not let the media know and everything like that. And then I think they'll be better. But, that mistake that they made now with that statement, I think for me has really showed that they might be on the way. They might be looking like COPE. And then as for Mashaba, I just feel, I also feel he might be a pragmatist, given his actions in recent years. But also at the same time, I think that he should just be careful with regards to being too much of a pragmatist, because now, again, EFF, you can't trust them. They'll stab you when they have the chance. So he needs to understand that as well, because he has to be principled in his leadership. Otherwise, again, it's going to collapse.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't COPE infiltrated by ANC spies or the government spies? And they orchestrated a leadership contest in which their candidate won. I think it was Shalova at that time. And that's why COPE basically disintegrated.
Yeah, Shiloh and Terralikota, yeah. Well, if it was an infiltration by the ANC, fine, but let's even though that may have been the case, the reality is that it didn't look good, because when I saw this on TV, I just saw guys throwing chairs at each other, and I'm like, I'm not going to vote for a party in disarray. Bye. And then you go. You don't care if it was an infiltration or not, you know. So I think it was an optics battle that was going on. But yeah, if it was an infiltration, well, kudos to the ANC.
Yeah, I think any new party is going to have its party squabbles. I just think as long as Herman Mashaba stays popular and the leader of the party, I think they will do fine. But if that changes, then it's going to be a problem. But yeah, Chris, you made an interesting point about, well, okay, I don't know if you mentioned this, but evangelicalism. They are forgotten voters in South Africa, I believe. The ACDP are not really capturing them. And it seems like Herman Mashaba is also trying to capture those votes. I think he frequently tweets about, yes, you have to stay true. He tweets quotes in the Bible. So I think he's also trying to capture those votes.
And you wonder, when so much analysis focuses on liberals, and here I mean more progressive suburban liberals, not classical liberals necessarily. You wonder, when so much attention is paid to them and the sort of learned classes, the white collar people who work in Sandton and places like that, where the focus, I think it's lost a lot on people who do blue collar work across the country. I mean, mechanics, electricians, plumbers, and then also who just try and run small businesses and small shops in their communities and their small towns all across the country. South Africa, for all of its urban migration, still has many small towns, smaller towns, where a lot of people live. They're closer to their churches, for example, their mosques. When you look at KZN, that sort of connection and community engagement is very important to them, and maybe they don't feel anyone is really speaking to them, because at the moment a lot of higher level politics seems to be very focused on more lofty policy decisions, for example. Then it's always useful to try and explain to people how those big policy decisions filter down even to the smallest town in the Karoo, and how it will affect them. For example, if expropriation goes through, then their own property rights will also be undermined. It's not just going to be sort of big farms in the Cape kind of thing. So I wonder where they might find a home, if they will find a home. I think someone, as you rightly point out, someone like Mashaba has identified that and will try and play to that. And I think if one is involved in politics and you're trying to sort of increase your support in your base, it would be to your advantage to play to those groups and those communities who are trying to become more self-sustaining and self-empowered. So if you don't come with your prescripts and your ideas from Bloemfontein or Pretoria and try and speak down from a sort of ivory tower, if you engage more with people on the ground and their own challenges and the issues that they face, and you try and help them empower themselves in their communities, I think there might be a political party who gets that sort of messaging and connection right, might do quite well across the country. I do think there's a bit of a gap there that's been unexplored, because at the moment we focus too much maybe on the sort of urban areas.
Yeah, I think it was Dr. Koptu Kroukamp who said that it's actually possible that ActionSA will be the second largest party in 2024, which, yeah, I don't know if that's possible. Dumo, do you think that's possible? Do you think they can expand their base beyond Gauteng and KZN and other places to get that, I don't know, 25%, 30%?
Yeah, it's definitely possible if they, perform the right actions. I think, I mean, the suburban votes is, it's gonna be a tough one for them to get, because I mean, there's DA there as well, and there's also some ANC in there. And then if you try to get more of the rural votes, I think, they probably can try, but I just don't see them as like a rural party. You know, they're not like FF Plus or the ANC. Like if you go to the rural areas, let's say you go to the Eastern Cape, for example. I mean, like I think most of the wards in the Eastern Cape were taken by ANC, like, and it's rural areas, right? So, changing that vote is going to be very, very difficult, because of the fact that ANC is like a brand, you know, people see ANC like their football teams, right? It's either Kaizer Chiefs or Pirates and ANC. It's like that, right? So I think ActionSA, it is definitely possible that they can become the second largest party, but they're really going to have to probably address the disgruntled ANC voters who feel that there isn't a decent alternative to the ANC and didn't vote. I think that's where they can gain a lot of potential. But yeah, I don't see where else they can get it from. But I just think the rural votes is key. And if they can actually do that and understand how those communities work and everything like that, they probably can make inroads in there. But definitely possible, but I think very unlikely. Yeah.
But can't they replicate what they did in Soweto? I think like in Soweto, what did they get? 20%, 30%? And I think the DA struggled to get like 15% over like 20 years. And the ActionSA like took most of that in like within a year. So why can't they go to other townships or rural areas and replicate that?
Okay. All right. Then I think then we have to make a distinction between townships and rural areas. Okay. Townships, urban townships, I think they have a chance because in urban townships, this is where we probably see the social dynamics playing out of like foreigners coming in and everything like that. So they might speak to those people. So if they speak to those people, they'll probably resonate with them a bit more. So urban townships, yes, I think they can do well in those ones. But rural areas, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to infiltrate. So if the urban townships are a bit more densely populated than the rural areas, so they might be seen as a more attractive target than the rural areas. So they can make inroads there. In the urban township, yes, they can do it. But again, if they get into that, and they, make some good inroads there, will it be enough? Only time will tell. But again, they need to also make good inroads into the rural areas as well if they really want to become the second largest party in the country.
Yeah, that's interesting that you pointed out. Obviously, there's a difference between a rural township and an urban township. And obviously, in an urban township, with more immigration, you'll see perhaps more xenophobia, which would play into ActionSA's hands. Yeah, I never really thought about that. But I want to switch this up a bit and talk about the future of libertarianism in South Africa. I find it frustrating that a lot of people say that the Democratic Alliance has to choose between being a classical liberal party and a social democratic party, because I feel that's a false dichotomy. It's like, I think really what they have to choose between is like what Herman and Mashaba is doing at the moment, being a conservative party or being a social democratic party. But the ANC and the EFF are already fighting for the social democratic vote. So that's not really an option. So you have to go the conservative route. There's no real future for classical liberalism anywhere. I don't see a classical liberal party or a libertarian party anywhere in the world that really has mainstream support. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Chris. What do you think? Can libertarianism like arise in South Africa within a party, or is it doomed to be a choice between conservatism and social democracy?
Yeah, that's a very good and difficult question. My way of trying to unpack it or answer it would be that you can see strands of libertarianism in, for example, conservatism. So we shouldn't expect a quote unquote libertarian party to win an election, for example. You can get a party like the Purple Cows, for example, a few years ago, speaking that sort of message and sticking to those hardcore principles and trying to sort of shake things up and just educating people a bit, but don't expect them to maybe win, everything across the whole country. That's not how a party like that, I think, should be set up. When you're the DA, for example, I think it is tempting to go the social democrat route because you think you need to play across the spectrum to get all the necessary votes, where I think in some ways that almost thinks too little of South Africans, where you don't think for some reason Black South Africans are pro property rights or pro the rule of law. Why Why the assumption that they're not pro classical liberal tenets and principles? I've never really understood that perspective. Just because there hasn't been a good communicator of those principles or a good vessel to share it with the people doesn't mean that there won't be resonance with those principles. So I would rather that people focus their hopes on applying libertarian and classically liberal principles in their lives and their community actions. I would argue, for example, becoming more state-proof is in itself libertarianism, the decentralization of power, trying to sort of take back a lot of the power and the controls that the central government, for example, in Pretoria has tried to expand over the last 27 years. Now that the state itself is failing, there's an opportunity for people to step into that. And to me, that sort of individual taking responsibility, taking action, making plans for your future, that is libertarianism in action. So we should maybe, instead of trying to look for a party with the libertarian flame on it, the classic liberty flame on the banner, if you're looking for that, then I'll probably agree with you. One shouldn't expect anything hopeful in that regard, but you should be hopeful when you see strong community action organizations and individuals taking steps to not just be dependent on the state anymore. I think that is very much the history of libertarianism and classical liberalism now being shaped in the South African context and taking shape here, where, I mean, don't tell some of the more hardcore conservatives this, but even them, like who traditionally, some of them have a great respect for authority, they're still taking back authority from the government. So in a way, even they are becoming classical liberals in a way, which is interesting to see how this all shakes out. So I'm trying to focus my hopes on just the steps that actual citizens take themselves, instead of waiting for a new political party or a political leader to make libertarianism mainstream in politics, as it were.
Yeah, Dumo, is the best that we can hope for federalism, a party that represents federalism?
Yeah, it is possible, but I don't know if that's our best hope. Because we just got a strong national government that just wants to control everything. So I think if it comes to federalism, I think that, I mean, it's more ideal than what we have now, because, I mean, you look at the country, look at the police service, for example, centralized, and you go to some communities, I mean, some police vehicles are not even working, you call them, you need to pick them up, and they're not there to, some of them are not even there to prevent crime. They're just there to collect case numbers, and that's it. And then put in a docket, and then they go home. So I think federalism is more ideal. But I think when it comes to whether if it will happen and the likelihood of it happening, it's very, very low. I think it's going to come at a point where the national government seems irrelevant, and they need to hold on to some semblance of power, and they can see that they're actually losing a lot of it. Then I do think that federalism can be negotiated with them. So especially if you're losing relevance and people want to hold on to the power, I think that's the best time to kind of negotiate, because they're kind of desperate. They know they can't go back to where they were before, but they can hold on to something. So right now, the government is not looking that great. I think they're losing a lot of influence. And I think that, like if you look at some municipalities, for example, some of them are not functional, and people are just doing their own thing. They're fixing the pipes, they fixing the sewage and everything like that, doing it themselves. So I think that seems like it looks like it's being a bit more libertarian in that sense. And then I think if that grows over time, then the government will either do one of two things. They'll try to shut it down, or they'll say, okay, listen, let's not try to shut it down, because, hey, we need to get votes. Let's negotiate. And I think once you get to that negotiation phase, I think the federalism talks can come through, and hopefully the people that do negotiate it at that particular point in time have enough influence to at least convince the government that actually federalism is the best answer. It'll be better for them, So hopefully that will be the case.
Chris, why do you think libertarianism, pure libertarianism, is so difficult to sell? I mean, I once put it to an interviewer, Johan Norberg from the Cato Institute in the United States, and I said to him, and he agreed to me, the two main reasons is it's because it promotes individual liberty or responsibility, and because it promotes optimism. It's a very optimistic message, libertarianism, and that's not what people really want. I think that's the main problem with libertarian. Why do you think? Why is it so difficult to sell that message?
I think the second point is very important because biologically, because of how humans sort of evolved and had to survive, they always had to be on the lookout for the possible worst case scenario. So those who sort of lay underneath the tree looking at the stars the whole time, they didn't necessarily see the saber-toothed tiger coming around the corner kind of thing. You need to be more prepared for these things. And even now, bad news sells a lot better than good news, for example, even though there's a lot of good news. If you look at the work that people like Norberg and others have done, if you look at the trend the last 100 years of the number of people lifted out of poverty, literacy rates increasing, the number of women dying in childbirth declining significantly, we should celebrate that progress. And those places around the world where more freedom has been tried have been relatively better off. It never, sort of liberty never promises a utopia. So we shouldn't expect that if we ever attain 100% liberty in a particular place, it's going to be utopian and everyone will have everything their heart desires. Liberty comes with risk, and with that personal responsibility, that first point that you made with taking action and agency for your own life. And I think for a lot of people that can be very intimidating. I mean, for some of us, we can't even decide in the morning what we're going to eat, never mind what we're going to do with our lives, what big goals are we going to try and follow and achieve. But I mean, in a way, that's great that responsibility rests on your own shoulders for you to try and figure out and make sense of. That's your life and your values that it falls on you to pursue if you ultimately choose to do so. So yeah, I like those 2 points as an explanation for why it's difficult to sell. And I also just think the need for some kind of stability or homeostasis is very overpowering for people, and liberty and more free societies bring more change. So we don't necessarily want things to change too much that makes it uncomfortable for us. And we think that if there's more freedom, some of the things that we hold dear will fall away. I think having more freedom allows you, for example, to engage with other people in terms of sharing resources and specialization, which means you don't have to spend 20 hours a day doing backbreaking labor in a field, for example, which frees up your time and your mind to pursue those things that are more important to you, or your sort of higher order goals. I don't know, reading and religion, those sorts of things, promoting your culture, that kind of thing. The fruits of capitalism that have come the last 100 years have made it easier for people, I think, to promote their cultures, to protect them, to make sure that they're strengthened, and people need to take advantage of that. So yeah, I think it's a never-ending struggle. There's always going to be temptations and pushes by statists and collectivists of all stripes, from the left, from the right, wherever different forms of populism, they're going to try and encroach on people's liberties. So the fight is never gonna end. But I think it's worthwhile, even those little wins of freedom that we do get. And even now in South Africa, where the state is failing so much, as Dumo has also pointed out, that in and of itself shows you that those ideas based on state force eventually collapse in on themselves, and liberty will win out, whether it's as big as we want it to be or not. In some ways, we're always working towards that.
Yeah, Dumo, it seems like we have become so used to the power of the state that libertarianism is almost, nobody can understand it. I mean, if you want to sell a message of, we need to get rid of the Ministry of Education or healthcare, it's like people like, okay, what are you going to put in its place? Like, people can't understand how you can possibly get rid of it. So is it because we have so gotten used to the size and the scope of the state that it's just almost impossible to sell that message?
Yeah, that is part of it. I think there's a lot of people. I mean, look, some people can't imagine life without a state. Not to say that libertarianism necessarily promotes that, but the state was like part of their lives. The state is what they have built the roads and everything like that. And then, so And usually what libertarians would argue for is that they'll say that taxation is theft, and then they'll try to argue it morally, and people say, oh, but who's going to build the roads and everything like that. So I think the reason why it's hard to sell as well, again, it's what another reason is that that Chris mentioned with regards to how we evolved. I do think based on how we evolved, fear and control seem to be evolutionary beneficial behaviors. So it seems that, and if you think about it, I mean, we even had slavery and everything like that, and for quite a long time. And control, that's what it is. I think part of that human element is to also control. And people feel that if they are under control, they might feel safe and stuff, because if they're out there on their own, they're more likely probably going to get eaten by that saber-toothed tiger. But obviously we still have these hunter-gatherer brains, but obviously in this capitalistic society, there probably isn't a saber-toothed tiger that's going to eat you alive. But, we still have those type of fears. And also, I think another reason why we can't sell it is because we're not pushing the moral argument for libertarianism. I think what I've noticed is that when I get through to people is when I try to provide a moral argument, right? And now I don't want to get too philosophical into this, and I mean, because there's utilitarian arguments for libertarianism and deontology and whatever, but I mean, just normal things. Like, for example, is it fair for someone to, take a portion of your property, and if you refuse to pay, they're going to throw you in their dungeon? Is it fair to do that? And then they'll be like, no, it's not fair to do that. And then you say, well, look, the government does that, right? And then, and it kind of like just, you kind of just challenge their perception slowly. And then eventually people start to realize, hey, you know what, the state is actually, they're not actually that moral. These guys are actually kind of selfish. They want to, expand their power and everything like that. So I think part of that is that we're not pushing the moral argument for libertarianism. We're not taking moral situations and saying, is it fair for the government to do that? Is it fair for the government to do this? I think that's another reason. And you'll find that when you start to push that over time, people tend to realize that, hey, you know what? Maybe the state is beneficial in some sense, but you know what? They can also work against me as well. So I think that's part of I think those are one of the reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. And in the 2016 American election, Donald Trump mentioned, or it came out, that he didn't pay a lot of taxes. And he replied, I'm paraphrasing, and he said that, yeah, that means I'm smart. And I mean, that was like a field day in politics when Hillary Clinton, I almost said Helen Ziller, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, everyone's like, how can you not pay your taxes? It's your moral duty. And it's just interesting to me in an interview that Joe Biden did with Jimmy Fallon at talk shows or late night talk shows in the United States, that Jimmy Fallon responded by saying, but how do you do that? How do you not pay your taxes? And I think that's like the average response from an average person. Like, how do you do that? Like, how do you stop paying taxes? Because that's actually what I want to do. So just a moment of like clarity, I believe, from Jimmy Fallon in that moment, that he doesn't have a lot. But yeah, so I think really the only solution, the only way we're really going to get libertarianism is through technology, because I think it gives you a lot of individual responsibility. Don't you think that's the case, Chris?
No, absolutely. I very, very strongly agree with you, especially if you look at the rate of technological advancement, despite the best intentions and plans of the bureaucrats, whether they're in Washington or in China. They can't always stop all the technological advancement. So it might be curtailed in some ways. It might be pegged back a little bit, as I fear it will now be in China, with the direction that it seems Xi Jinping is taking his country in, a more insular and anti-innovation route. But ultimately, yes, the best way is to try and state-proof yourself again. That concept, that word, is to try and make sure your different parts of your life are in different spheres, and that it's not just, for example, in a physical brick and mortar shop, but that you also have your online business, that you have your cloud is secure, all of that stuff, even, crypto, that kind of thing. We can obviously delve into that for hours about the merits or weaknesses of crypto itself, but just the possibility of it is incredibly interesting. And then if you just look at sort of encryption and blockchain and protecting your personal information from bureaucrats, what they might try and do with all of that, and sort of mine you as an individual and make you just a number based on your sort of data and statistics, how they might try and use it to sort of shape society. I think it's very important to protect that as closely as you can. And if people can make sure that they aren't really dependent on the state, for example, for electricity, so that you can still stay connected regardless of what happens in South Africa, for example, with load shedding, I think you'll set yourself up quite well. And linked to that is the idea of the more technology advances, the easier it is to, for example, have wealth offshore and in different forms. So what happens in South Africa, you're going to have your property here and your investments, but if things go very badly here, at least you'll have something overseas that you can use and perhaps rely on. The same thing if things go badly, if you have an investment in the US, then you still have your money and certain assets here in South Africa, for example. So yeah, I think there's a lot of reason to peg your sort of hopes on technological advancement and innovation. But I will say, again, it falls on people to actually take those steps and that sort of responsibility. So again, it shouldn't just be maybe assumed and taken for granted that it's going to happen regardless. It's up to us to implement these things in various ways. And you might not succeed the first time. There's no guarantee of things are going to work exclusively and absolutely, but at least you're trying different ways to make sure that you and your family and your community, those things that are important to you, are at least protected in small ways from the ravages of the bureaucrats.
Yeah. How are you guys doing there in Johannesburg with things like electricity and water? Because here in the Western Cape, we are quite insulated from those problems. And it's interesting to hear the scope of the problems. I recently spoke to Davi Root, who said that he hasn't had electricity for like 10 days. So what's happening? Do you have any such problems?
Not when the country goes through bouts of load shedding, then different areas of Johannesburg will of course get load shed. I will say that, and Gareth van Onselen, who writes weekly for Business Day, he wrote a very depressing piece on the sort of state and decline of Johannesburg last year, I think, when you can even see when the sidewalks, for example, when the grass doesn't get mown, when the sort of municipal workers don't come and mow the grass, what does that tell you about the general direction of the sort of city? When the street lamps are broken, that idea of the nature is encroaching again, it's coming back to seize its territory, and people aren't really taking responsibility for maintaining the roads. I will say in most areas where I am, generally potholes are becoming ever more and more prevalent, and not just like, small potholes that you can zoom over. Not that I'm advocating people drive 150 Ks in the suburbs, but sort of big potholes that like sinkholes kind of thing are starting to develop. And you wonder what it's going to take for the municipality to start getting a handle on the stuff again, because I know finances in the city have been going downhill for the last 5 years, maybe sort of reckless spending and not spending on the actual equipment and resources that people need. So yeah, I think there are pockets of where the city really is going backwards and downhill, unfortunately. Not all of us can live in the Western Cape utopia, not yet anyway.
Isn't there someone who died in a pothole, or is that just a joke my dad told? No, but
if that's your dad's sense of humor, I mean, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I can just imagine like the size of some potholes. It's possible that someone can die inside one. But Dumo, do you think technology is how we can achieve libertarianism? Because it seems like everything is connected and it promotes individual responsibility. That's essentially what technology does. It gives you more and more and more power as an individual.
Yes, I think it can promote libertarianism. Yeah, obviously it's going to rely on a lot of cooperation from people, but definitely it can. I think we should take into account that there's a lot of these decentralized platforms. And I mean, when I say decentralized, I'm saying away from like big tech and the government. that are where people can say what they want and so forth, and they promote free speech and everything like that. But also we can also use technology to build our own programs, build stuff like sites for education and everything like that. So I do believe that it'll give individuals more choice with technology. And if these alternatives are better than what the state can provide, then people are going to gravitate towards that. So definitely it will promote more libertarianism, in my opinion. And it's just that now we also have to be considerate that the state, if they see this, they will either try to get a piece of the pie or they want to take control of it completely. So we need to also kind of, again, state-proof ourselves in that way, so that if the state tries to get involved, they won't be able to. So if you look at Bitcoin, for example, you get or not Bitcoin, but crypto, you get a wallet, and that wallet is a very long, it's a very long code, and it's not associated to a name, it's not associated to an ID number, only you know it. So if you can create those type of technologies that can provide better alternatives to the state, then I think we're heading down the right path, and it's good. It's a very good thing, because we have a fiat currency system as well that's not doing well. I mean, we see now that inflation is not in the US; it's also big, even here as well. And people are probably going to move off that and use some other currency in the process. So definitely, I'm liking the prospects.
Yeah. Well, yeah, gentlemen, I see our time is running out. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been great, very interesting. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, any last words, Chris?
Well, thanks very much, Donald, and to Dumo as well. Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, we talked about applying libertarianism in your life, so try and support organizations who can help you in that fight and try and fight back against the encroaching state. So please support organizations like the Freemarket Foundation, Institute of Race Relations, AfriForum, Gift of the Givers as well. I think all of these sorts of charity organizations, we shouldn't underestimate the work that they're doing. So that's pretty much the main sort of request that I have for the listeners. Thank you.
Dumo?
Okay, sorry, my mic was off. Yes, yeah, guys, yeah, thanks for having me on, Donald and Chris. It was also great chatting to you. And also have to echo what you just stated, support these organizations, IRR, AfriForum, you name it, community-based organizations and stuff like that. Please support them. And yeah, I mean, we need to, understand that we can really defend ourselves against state encroachment, and, just get active within your community, see which organizations you can support, and support local businesses, support, local podcasts and everything like that, independent media like WorldView and stuff like that, because we need more of that. Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And I definitely can echo all your statements. Support the Freemarket Foundation and all libertarian organizations, and Man Patria. Please go watch his videos. It's great. But yeah, to our viewers, if you've made it this far, you most certainly enjoyed our content. Please like, subscribe, donate, share our videos. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.